In the 1970s and 80s, archaeologists and cavers in Britain were excavating a site called Charterhouse Warren down in Somerset. The cave consisted of a 21-meter deep shaft with 2 chambers at the bottom. Inside, they found some Roman and Iron Age archaeology, the remains of an auroch, prehistoric wild cow, big cow, and the bodies of at least 30 people who lived about 4,000 years ago. We'll never know how or why they got in there, but it seems from the injuries on their bodies that they were chucked in. They were thrown in. Bit of a bummer for them, for sure. The last bummer of their life. One thing we can say for sure, though, is at least 2 of them had the plague, aka the Black Death, aka Yersinia pestis.
And of the individuals we sampled, so this is individuals of all different ages, and we sampled 30 teeth from this site. And of these 30 teeth, 2 of them were positive for Yersinia pestis.
That's Dr. Pooja Swali. I had the pleasure of chatting to her and Frederik Seersholm, 2 geneticists studying this prehistoric plague outbreak that swept through Europe at an incredibly pivotal time in our history, the Neolithic to Bronze Age transition, a time of huge cultural and demographic change right across the whole continent. With their help, we're going to really dig into this topic today. How did they find the plague? How was it spread? How deadly was it? And crucially, what impact did it have in this crucial time period? It was absolutely fascinating chatting to them. I can't wait to share it with you all, and it allows me to break out my Bronze Age spear finally. This was the height of technology 4,000 years ago. First, let's put this plague in its appropriate context. The Neolithic period represents the end of the Stone Age. Basically, it's the Stone Age, but we're farming. Probably the most iconic tool of the Neolithic time period are these polished stone axes. Honestly, they're absolutely beautiful. One of my favorite prehistoric artifacts. You just know they feel so good in the hand, so smooth and heavy. And in really rare cases, archaeologists have even found them still hafted, which is incredible. I've even got a replica here. Shout out Ancient Craft. Mine is not polished because I'm a lazy farmer. Obviously, when people say the Stone Age, a part of your brain can't help but think of bumbling cavemen. But this couldn't be further from the truth. The Neolithic time was a period of huge architectural achievement. Some of our greatest prehistoric monuments date to this time period. Stonehenge, Avebury, all the incredible sites in Scotland, like the Ring of Brodgar, all fantastic sites. Huge megalithic architecture was being made. Communities were in contact across a wide stretch of the continent and the country. It's honestly one of my favorite time periods in prehistory. I absolutely love learning about the Neolithic. Shout out to them. Many of these monuments are aligned to the movements of the stars and the sun and the moon, all these things. These farming communities were intimately connected to the changing of the seasons and the change of time. It really was a time of incredible architectural achievement and development all across Europe, not just in Britain. There are incredible sites all across Europe too. The people of Britain and Europe at that time lived in small farming villages, farming things like barley and peas and wheat, pigs and cows and sheep. Farming had originally begun in the Near East, in the Fertile Crescent, starting about 12,000 years ago. It's debatable when it started, but about 12,000 years ago is a good ballpark figure. These communities then spread out across Europe and Asia and North Africa, eventually reaching Britain about 6,000 years ago. The people of Neolithic Britain often buried themselves in these big communal monuments. Some, like the West Kennet Long Barrow, are still very much intact. There are also incredibly huge monuments still intact in Ireland. But most of the time, the mounds and the monuments these people were buried in have eroded away, and we're just left with these huge stones across the landscape of Britain and other places, and they're beautiful, man. They're beautiful. They're like ghosts of another time. Life in Britain went on like this for about 1,000 years. However, around 4,300 years ago in Britain, and a little bit earlier in the continent, everything seems to have started to change. The amount of villages we find declines. The amount of monuments being built declines. Following this decline, a new culture appears in the archaeological record. About 4,300 years ago, Just a couple of hundred years after the big stone sarsens at Stonehenge were erected, a man was buried nearby. Today, we call him the Amesbury Archer. He was buried with some objects that would be really familiar to the previous Neolithic people, like flint arrowheads. However, he also had some items that would be very strange to them. Metals, golden hair ties, copper knives. This was the start of the Bronze Age. Instead of being buried in these big communal monuments, the Amesbury Archer had a grave all to his own. And many of these Bronze Age graves still dot the landscape around Stonehenge, and all across Europe we find these round barrows. I've actually excavated a Bronze Age barrow. This is one of the few things I've actually excavated back when I was doing my degree in Czechia. Shout out to the University of Pilsen. It was really incredible. This barrow had been plowed flat by 4,000 years of agriculture occurring on the site, and everything in the grave had been totally smashed to bits, except for this dog that this Bronze Age chap was buried with. The dog was still perfectly articulated, every bone in its perfect position after 4,000 years. I didn't take a picture of it, or at least I don't have a picture of it anymore because I'm a moron. It would be nice to think that this Bronze Age chap would be happy about that their dog survived the ravages of time. More or less. Still dead, of course. But interestingly, the Amesbury Archer was buried with these large clay beakers, 5 large clay beakers. Like this. This is another replica of the clay beaker from pottedhistory.co.uk. Again, these beakers are not unique to Britain, they're found across Europe. Archaeologists call this new culture the beaker culture because we're just full of imagination. One hypothesis is that these beakers were important for feasting or something like that. They were clearly very important to the people at that time. Many burials found with these big clay beakers. I should drink something out of this. I've never done that before. I should probably fill it with beer and chug it. That's probably what our Bronze Age ancestors would want me to do. For a very long time, archaeologists had debated what was the cause of this shift in culture from Stone Age farmers with their stone axes to these beaker people. Was it local people just adopting a new culture? Or were these a new group, new people? Well, thanks to genetics, we now have the answer to that question.
Because in population genetics, we see these 2 massive shifts where, like, first we have the hunter-gatherers, and then for some reason they disappear. They're probably just replaced by the people who knew how to farm, so the farmers. And then they are then again replaced by the Bronze Age people. I guess the first transition, a lot of people have been arguing that maybe it involved violence. But the second transition, like when the farmers disappeared, it just seems like they just evaporate, basically. Like there's no evidence from them. And there is no ancestry surviving from them in the next population. So in the steppe people, we find no like Scandinavian farmer ancestry. So for some reason they just completely disappear.
These 2 moments, the shift from hunter-gatherers to Neolithic farmers, and then from Neolithic farmers to Bronze Age people, beaker people, at least genetically, these are the most significant moments in European prehistory that we're aware of at the minute.
So if you just want to group ancient genomes, you always find that they are grouped into 3 major groups. So you have the hunter-gatherers and the farmers and then the steppe people. And then within those groups, you'll see some geographical structure, for example, or some temporal structure, something like that. But you always find that they cluster into these 3 massive groups. So from an ancient DNA or population genetics perspective, if you get a random genome, it's very easy to tell whether it's from a hunter-gatherer, a farmer, or a steppe-related individual.
Frederik called the Bronze Age people there people with steppe ancestry because this movement of bronze-wielding people seems to have begun around the Eurasian steppe, modern Ukraine and Russia. The Yamnaya culture, who also buried people in barrows or kurgans, as they're called, on the continent in Eastern Europe, they're often associated with this migration of people. And incredibly, we can still get a kind of a glimpse at what these people look like or thought of themselves. This is the Kernasivsky idol. It's about 120 meters tall and was found outside Dnipro in Ukraine. It's about 5,000 years old. It was found in association with some Yam-Naya artifacts. It just gives us an incredible insight into how these very early Bronze Age people viewed themselves. We don't often see a representation of themselves in this time period, at least in Europe. Axes tucked into his belt, bow and arrow over his shoulder, willy pointing upwards. It's not the only Bronze Age statue we found. It's just an incredible example. The Amesbury archer from outside Stonehenge was also a part of this Bronze Age migration of people. We can tell from isotope analysis of his bones and teeth that he originally grew up in the Alps, southern Germany, Austria, northern Italy, Switzerland, that region, before eventually making it to Britain for whatever reason. So we know the change from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age was driven by this huge cultural and demographic change. A new group of people moving across the continent, not really mixing at all with the previous Neolithic population. Why? Why did this dramatic change happen? What was driving it? And did the plague play a role in it? Okay, let's take a look at this plague. This is Pooja's paper here. Yersinia pestis genomes reveal plague in Britain 4,000 years ago. This study relied on samples from 2 Bronze Age sites. The first was Levens Park, Ringcairn in northern England.
So for Levens Park, we had 4 individuals at this burial, which was normal for this time period. So 4 individuals, and we sampled all 4, and we found 1 individual with plague, which was a female, I believe, an adult female.
The other was Charterhouse Warren, that really strange cave site I mentioned in the introduction.
So with Charterhouse Warren specifically, this was a really interesting site because it wasn't a normal burial for its time period. It's still in press, so there's still some more information about this site specifically coming out by Rick Schulting. And it was this mass burial with a lot of trauma associated to all the individuals. And of the individuals we sampled 30, so this is individuals of all different ages, and we sampled 30 teeth from this site. And of these 30 teeth, 2 of them were positive for Yersinia pestis.
So out of the 34 samples taken, only 3 were identified as having the plague, Yersinia pestis. That doesn't sound a lot, does it? That doesn't sound a lot. I had to ask Pooja, is that significant in any way?
It's hard to say if that's a high number because with ancient DNA and ancient pathogens, just because something isn't present or we can't find it doesn't mean that individual didn't have it. As we mentioned, the Yersinia pestis genomes or pathogen genomes, like they degrade. It's very dependent on preservation, our ability to detect it. And so we can never say a negative is truly a negative.
For a disease to be discoverable, the bacterial load has to be so high that it's found in the pulp cavity of your teeth, the only part of your teeth with a blood supply.
It has to be systemic for us because if it doesn't make its way into the blood, then we wouldn't be able to get it out of the tooth. So a lot of infections that are like gastrointestinal, and we're less likely to find unless they, again, manage to get into the blood, because we're not looking at soft tissue, we're looking at skeletal remains, and we're looking at teeth specifically.
This means that potentially more of the people involved in the study did have the plague, but the bacterial load was not high enough or was so small that it just hasn't been preserved. Just to give you some extra context here, the paper to the side of me was looking at detecting plague in people who had the Black Death from known Black Death burial sites, specifically from Smithfield in London. They had 109 samples, but could only detect plague in 20 cases. And these are people we absolutely know for sure died of the Black Death. So just because we're finding smaller numbers in these sites doesn't mean that more people didn't have the plague. One thing I really wondered was, do geneticists go in with this specific mind of we're going to go and try and find the plague? Or are they casting a wide net and just seeing what they discover?
And so the way we sequence the genomes, we take the samples from the pulp chamber of the tooth, and we kind of take any DNA that could have caused a systemic infection and be lingering within the individual at the time of death. And we extract that genome, and we use a process called metagenomics to just look for any systemic infection that could have been in that individual. So the fact that the individuals had this plague genome, we weren't set out to look for it.
It's kind of mind-blowing, to be honest. It's kind of mind-blowing how far genetics has come, that we can just cast this wide net and just see what's there, see what genomes are there. It's honestly endlessly fascinating to me. Thanks to these scientific advances and the hard work of Pooja and other geneticists across Europe, the scale of this plague is starting to be revealed to us. Take a look at this map here from Pooja's paper. This is all the Bronze Age sites where plague has been detected at the time of publishing. We have these sites in the west of Britain, loads in Central Europe, Germany, Austria, Czechia, Poland, as far north as Estonia, and as far east as Mongolia and eastern Russia. All of the genomes in orange and pink, they're all related. It's all part of the same outbreak. Behind this huge outbreak of the plague lies kind of a mystery, kind of an intriguing mystery. Only 2 of the plague genes that have been studied so far have this YMT gene. That's what geneticists call it, YMT gene. And that's kind of interesting.
Because this gene is known to enhance the ability for Yersinia pestis to colonize the flea.
This gene seems to be essential for the plague to survive in the belly of fleas. And it seems to not be a widespread feature of this plague outbreak. This bacteria just don't seem to have it, other than a couple of rare cases. This means that, unlike the famous Black Death from medieval Europe, it might not be spread by fleas. It might be some other spreading mechanism going on. The plague can also manifest itself as a form of pneumonic plague, where you get it in your lungs, you're coughing, you're spluttering, and you spread it to people that way. So that is one possibility for this plague outbreak. They didn't necessarily have the big buboes, that were common in the medieval outbreak. This is an important question, though, because it sort of makes you wonder, if it's not being transmitted by fleas, then where was this plague when it wasn't in us? As I learned from Pooja and Frederik, plagues like to have what they call a reservoir species. This is the host animal where the plague is living before it spreads to humans and becomes an outbreak amongst us. In the medieval plague, it was rats. Rats get bitten by the fleas. Fleas give it to us. But again, geneticists are not sure in this situation what is going on and where this plague is living when it's not in us. And to understand why, we have to look at the family tree of all of these plague outbreaks. We have to see how they're related to each other. Okay, so this is the family tree of all the different bacteria that had been found when this study was published. This is how they all relate to each other. And below on the map, we can see where these samples came from. You would think that the cases close to each other geographically are close to each other on this family tree because they're in the nearby area. That must be what's going on. But it isn't. There's something strange going on here. Don't lose me in the technical details here. This is kind of interesting and kind of significant. Let's take a look down here in southern Russia. We have KNK001 and we have KLZ001. Obviously very close to each other geographically. But they are not close to each other on the family tree. Let's take a look here. KNK001 is down here. KLZ001 is up here. The samples from Britain are actually closely related to KLZ001. And lots of sites across Europe fall in between these 2 bacteria in the family tree. So in the 500 years between these 2 Russian samples, the plague had spread all the way to Britain and all the way back again. How is it doing that? How is it spreading?
If there's a reservoir species, you're almost expecting there to be some sort of relationship with, yes, the diversity, but also the geographic location of that pathogen, of that strain specifically. But what we're seeing is that there isn't this relationship of geography and these strains. So where is this Yersinia pestis, where is the strain living?
The fact that we don't have this strong correlation between geography and the relationship of the strains, their position in this family tree, has kind of led the geneticists to wonder if it's even living in a reservoir species at all. Maybe in this outbreak, we are the reservoir species. Maybe it's just in us.
So what do you think is the most likely cause of it spreading?
Well, we've had so many debates about this. I'm not really sure. Personally, I would say it's unlikely to be maintained by reservoir species is what I think is the situation. And it's more maintained by movements of people in large groups rather than rodents. But that might be completely wrong. That might be proven wrong with more research. So I think we just need more genomes to try and piece together this story of this lineage.
Maybe this plague is just being spread by the huge movements of Bronze Age people at this time. Kind of interesting that we can't even say for sure whether it's living in another species. This whole conversation with Pooja and Frederik upended a lot of my assumptions that I had about the plague. It's so much more complex than I had initially thought. So far, all we've discussed are cases from the Bronze Age. All these orange dots from Pooja's study are all people with steppe-related ancestry. If we're going to prove a link between the decline of the Neolithic people and the plague, though, we need to find some samples in Neolithic communities. And this is where Frederik's study comes in. Repeated plague infections across 6 generations of Neolithic farmers.
It all started because we knew that there was one plague case from a passage grave in Scandinavia, in Sweden.
The plague case Frederik is referring to can be seen on the map from Pooja's study again. It's this one, Gokhem 2. This was an outbreak of plague detected in a Neolithic individual. There's also another one from Latvia, this RV2039. That comes from the Neolithic time period, but was actually found in a hunter-gatherer. It was debated whether these 2 cases were part of a widespread outbreak or just a one-time transmission of the plague. To try and answer that question, Frederik and his team went back to this Swedish tomb.
And that was passage graves. That's these sort of rectangular graves with one entrance. So that's why they're called passage graves. So we decided to sample that side heavily, like just try to get as many bones as we could get our hands on, and then also include passage graves from the neighborhood within 5 kilometers, because this particular area in Sweden is basically packed with passage graves. So they are everywhere. Well, if you're standing on one hill, you might be able to see 10 passage graves or something like that. So, and you can still see them in the landscape. They're basically everywhere. Unfortunately, many of these have already been excavated. So it was quite easy to just contact the archaeologists and then get a bunch of samples from that area.
In total, Frederik and the team were able to get 108 samples from 8 different sites, all from around this village called Falköping. Sorry, everyone in Sweden. Of these 108, 18 definitely had the plague. But 13 of those 18 were from this one tomb, Fralsa Garden, the same tomb where they had originally found the plague in earlier studies.
And that's, of course, the main finding. That was surprisingly high. Like we were expecting to find it, but not that often.
Seemingly quite a significant outbreak for it to be detected in so many individuals. What's interesting and perhaps incredibly significant is that these graves date to between 5,200 and 4,900 years ago. This period of decline in the Neolithic where the villages start disappearing and the monuments stop being built seems very significant, to be honest. Such a large sample from tombs that are very close to each other geographically allowed Frederik to reconstruct the family ties between all these different groups of people. And that allowed them to understand how the plague is spreading through the community.
So this bit here is actually my favorite part of the paper, because that was sort of an unexpected add-on. We hadn't really expected to find that many related individuals, but of course it makes sense once you start to sequence every single individual of a grave. Well, then you might expect that a lot of related individuals would pop up. So the more individuals we sequenced during the beginning or the early phases of this study, the more related individuals we found. And it was like trying to solve a big puzzle, only having like half of the pieces, and then trying to find more pieces, and then I almost managed to solve it completely, and that was a very satisfying feeling. It's great fun to try to piece together this big puzzle.
By tying together this family tree, Frederik could clearly see the Neolithic society was kind of patrilineal. The males in these tombs all descend directly from each other: grandfather, father, grandson. For the women, though, this wasn't necessarily the case.
If you pick a random female, you'll find that every single female from the grave is only related to her children and grandchildren and so on. So this shows that females were brought in from the outside. And the funny thing is that for one of these females, we actually did find her brothers, and they were buried in another grave. I think it was 7 kilometers away. So in this family tree, circles are always females and squares are always males.
And the FRA and the HJE, these represent the archaeological sites?
Yes.
FRA, HJE. One second. Let's see where these people were moving.
Yeah.
FIA. So I imagine FRA, this woman was in Frälsargarden. Sorry,
Yes.
Sweden, for my pronunciation. And the brothers were in Hjalmarsrå.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So this is, to
Interesting.
my knowledge, the first time that people have directly showed this female exogamy. And it's of course super interesting to know exactly where she then came from. And it turns out, I guess not very surprisingly, that she didn't move very far.
The village down the road, yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. What are the odds of finding the brothers in another grave from individuals that were buried 5,000 years ago? That's fascinating, I think.
Building this huge family tree, though, isn't just nice because we get to see how they're all related to each other, and it gives us a glimpse into the social structure of Neolithic society. All of that stuff is great. But more importantly for us, it allows us to see how this plague is spreading through this community. And all in all, it turns out that Frederik and his team found 3 outbreaks of the plague in about a 120-year span.
The first one hit in generation 1, and then there is one in what we think is in generation 2, and both of these outbreaks are kind of contained, so there aren't that many individuals with these plague strains.
It was the 3rd outbreak of this plague, though, that seems to have hit the community really hard.
For the last outbreak, we do find this pattern that you would expect from an epidemic. We find it to be very prevalent, and we find it across multiple individuals, and we find the exact same strain across these individuals.
I imagine that finding the exact same strain is key because it suggests it's spreading so quickly there's no mutations or something.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah. That is sort of one thing that it could last a year or something like that, but it wouldn't last 10 years.
Does it suggest that plague variant is getting more deadly as time goes on? Is that a possible conclusion from that, or is it kind of hard to say?
Yeah, so that is very difficult to say. So that is our hypothesis. So our hypothesis is that for some reason, the last one is more deadly than the others because of the pattern in which we find it. Like because it's way more prevalent than the other ones, and because it's only found in the last generations. So if you look only at the last 2 generations of the left-hand family tree, then it's actually present in 6 out of 7 individuals.
6 out of 7 family members confirmed to have the plague. That's really a lot. Considering what we said earlier about the challenges of detecting the plague, I would bet that 7th person had it as well. Why would an outbreak of the plague get seemingly increasingly more deadly, more virulent, over the span of 100 years? 100 years isn't that much time for something to evolve. This is when Frederik introduced me to a concept I had never heard of before, gene reshuffling.
But what might happen is that genes might be shuffled around or genes might be lost, and that can actually change the virulence of the disease quite dramatically. So that's what we think has happened here. That is not sort of normal evolution, but what is called, I guess we can call it gene reshuffling. And the thing is that we observe this gene reshuffling in a region that we know is associated with virulence. So it's from this region called YPN, and it's known from another bacteria called Yersinia pseudotuberculosis, where it can cause a disease called Far East scarlet-like fever. So it's interesting because we know it's in a region associated with disease that this happens.
Interesting.
And I guess together with all of the other observations, like the fact that we find it often and that it's in the last generations, then we think that this might actually explain why this became more deadly.
I'm not going to lie, I'm no geneticist. Once we start going down the gene reshuffling rabbit hole, it's starting to go a little bit over my head, to be honest. But the key takeaway is, in this last generation of Neolithic farmers, right at the point where their society is seemingly declining, there were 3 outbreaks of the plague, and seemingly, with the evidence from these sites, the plague was getting more virulent, more deadly perhaps. I really wanted to know from Frederik, is this Neolithic strain related to the Bronze Age strain? Are we discussing one event here, one enormous outbreak of the plague that kept circling for hundreds and hundreds of years? Or is this just coincidence?
So the Neolithic strains are ancestors of the Bronze Age strains, and they are split by roughly 500 years of evolution. So the changes that you normally accumulate over 500 years. But say if you compare to the Black Death, those two are very similar. Like the Neolithic and the Black Death, they are quite different. But the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, pretty close.
500 years. That's not so much. In the time frame of the Neolithic Bronze Age transition, that's not so much.
No.
And just to summarize then, based on this study, this question of Neolithic Bronze Age transition, how likely do you think plague played a role in this transition? How confident are you in that?
Well, I'm a scientist, so not very, but I guess I'm never very confident. But one of the main sort of things that have been put forward early on, suggesting that one of the main arguments against the plague being involved in the Neolithic decline was that it was only found in one individual before. So there's been other papers saying that, well, it seems like it's just randomly popping up. Like it's just in this one individual in Sweden, and then it's also in a hunter-gatherer in Latvia. So there's been researchers saying that maybe it just every now and then jumps from an animal reservoir where it's living, like rats, for example, into the human population. And maybe it wasn't able to spread within humans. And this paper definitely shows that it's not random and it's not rare. It's prevalent and it's widespread in Scandinavia. So I guess that we know for sure. And it's also very likely that it was actually able to spread within humans, because otherwise we wouldn't find it so often in the same family, for example. So I think what this paper adds is that we've shown that it could have happened this way. Plague was able to cause an outbreak, an epidemic, like reach epidemic-like proportions. Whether it actually did, I guess we need more samples to show that for sure.
Interesting.
And a really interesting observation is, of course, that this plague is found in the very latest Neolithic individuals from Sweden, like the very last ones. And then afterwards, they just disappear. That's also very strong circumstantial evidence that the plague was involved in the Neolithic decline in some way.
In the woods. I gotta walk into the woods every video. I don't know what it is. If you're like me, at this point I'm thinking I've got it all figured out. We have this enormous cultural demographic change, very difficult to explain. And at the same time, we see this huge plague outbreak across steppe people and Neolithic people of southern Sweden. You can't help but think these have to be related. Well, here is the obligatory injection of nuance. We don't actually know that these people died of plague.
So I suppose we can't say if these people died of the plague.
No, unfortunately not. We can say that, we can just say that they had plague at the time that they died, but there's no evidence to say that these individuals died from the plague or how bad their symptoms were when they had it.
This might seem a really odd thing to say because, of course, we know from more recent history, like the medieval time, that the Black Death can be incredibly deadly. It can wipe out half a continent's worth of people. But the thing to keep in mind is bacteria are evolving all the time. As we go further and further back in time, Yersinia pestis is going to get closer to its closest relative, Yersinia pseudotuberculosis. Yersinia pseudotuberculosis just lives in the ground. There's probably some right there. No, I don't know. But it just lives in the ground. And if we get an infection from that, it basically just gives us a tummy ache. It's not very deadly. And yet its closest relative, the plague, can be extremely deadly. We don't actually know if Yersinia pseudotuberculosis has gotten less deadly or the plague has gotten more deadly.
But yes, so we go further back in time and they're becoming more and more similar. So how far do we go till we see their common ancestor, What did that disease look like?
We could try and find out how deadly these plague strains are, but that's probably not a very popular option at the minute.
And also because if you really wanted to test how deadly an ancient strain of the plague was, then you would have to recreate it in the lab. And that doesn't sound great, does it?
Yeah, I'm sure since 2020, the appetite for that is reduced a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. All we can say is that in order for us to find plague DNA in their teeth, the DNA or the bacteria must have entered the bloodstream because there is a little bit of blood flow in the teeth. And normally, when a bacteria enters the bloodstream, it's very dangerous.
The other bit of nuance to consider, if we're imagining this scenario where the plague sweeps across the land, it wipes out the Neolithic people, leaving room for the Bronze Age people to expand, is we know that the Bronze Age people had the plague too. So why weren't they affected? The only way I can sort of rationalize it in my mind is imagining a scenario similar to when Europeans reached the Americas. And the Native Americans didn't have immunity to the diseases that we brought with us. Maybe there's a similar dynamic in the Bronze Age. Maybe these steppe people already had some immunity to the plague. In my head, I sort of maybe can't help but compare it to when Europeans arrived in the Americas. Was sort of my comparison there.
Yeah.
But it seems that the Neolithic people already had it.
That's a good point, actually. I hadn't really thought much of this. So maybe if, say, the steppe people, they arrived in Eastern Europe 5,200 years ago. I don't know about the exact numbers. Well, then maybe you could imagine a scenario where they then infect farming people from Eastern Europe with the plague, and then it sort of spreads very quickly throughout Europe through farming populations. Maybe that could explain it. That's a good point.
To answer that question, I suppose we would need more and more samples from further east in Eastern Europe on the Eurasian steppe, pushing this plague outbreak further and further back in time. What was going on in the 500 years between these Neolithic people and the Bronze Age outbreak? Hey guys, one last interruption. Editing Stefan here. As I'm saying this, it's August 30th. It takes a long time to put these videos together. David Reich just appeared on this podcast talking about this very topic, talking about how he believes this plague was very deadly, also likening it to European contact in the Americas. It's well worth a watch. I'll put it in the description. Just adding more nuance to this, adding more to the debate whilst it's being edited. I'll get this video out as quick as I can. Actually, no, it's not the last interruption. Holy moly. Another paper has just come out arguing that the plague didn't cause this mass outbreak because of it being detected in 2 individuals in the same cemetery. They're having different strains. They also found it in a dog. It's on the screen next to me. You can see there's not much consensus about this at the minute. And if everyone could stop publishing papers so I could finish this video, that would be fantastic. Thank you. One really interesting place to study this, to expand this work, would be to look at these huge urban areas that developed in the Neolithic in Eastern Europe. They're basically Europe's first cities. Thousands of people were living together, probably. They disappeared, seemingly quite suddenly, for reasons that are heavily debated. Again, kind of connected to this transition to the Bronze Age. It would be really interesting to get samples of the people that lived in these urban areas to test them for plague. We basically just need more samples from earlier and from further east.
And it could also, of course, be a combination of different factors. Like it could be, say, the plague hitting first, killing half the population, and then war breaking out. It could also be a combination of famine and the plague. So you could have a combination of the different sort of factors that have already been proposed.
It's fair to say at the minute, we can't definitively say how much of an impact this plague had at the transition from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age. But it is extremely interesting that so much plague has been detected in this pivotal moment when the population changed so much. I can't help but believe that they're connected. Even though we cannot say that definitively at the minute, I can't help but think they are connected. That's just my opinion. I would like to leave you guys with one last final thought, one last interesting speculation, some daydreaming, existential dread maybe. Hopefully, on the screen right now, you are looking at a picture of one of the sarsen stones at Stonehenge, which the Bronze Age people had carved little images of axes onto. The axe was very symbolic to them. They had carved it onto this sarsen stone, which they didn't build, right? Stonehenge was built by the Neolithic people. In my head, when I imagined this transition from the Bronze Age to the Neolithic, I had always imagined some sort of interaction with these people. The Bronze Age people turned up, and they in some way interacted with the builders of Stonehenge, whether that was positively or negatively. They had contact with each other. It's fascinating to imagine, to speculate on a scenario where the Bronze Age people arrived to an empty landscape. They never met the Neolithic people, they never met the builders of Stonehenge, and just sort of stumbled upon these giant monuments that they couldn't explain. Interesting to imagine that. It's possible. It's possible that that's how history went down. Cool. Well, anyway, that's all I know about the Bronze Age plague. See you guys. Thanks for watching. Boop. Hello. Thank you for watching. I have a new video out on a different kind of Stone Age, Stoned Age, the archaeology of the first ever stoners. It's part archaeology video, part personal anecdotes about a couple of hazy times in my life. It's a fun little video. It's not on YouTube though, it's on Nebula. Nebula is a streaming platform owned by the creators themselves. I honestly couldn't do what I do without Nebula's help. All the fancy footage of really obscure archaeological sites and drone shots of tombs, all this stuff, it all comes from Nebula. And it's become one of the fastest growing and most interesting streaming sites on the internet, for sure. If you love educational videos, it's the place to be. Not only do you get ad-free access to all of my videos and tons of educational creators, but you also get a bunch of exclusive content too, really high quality stuff. The one I'm most looking forward to watching, considering the recent politics that just occurred this week, is Tom Nicholas's Boomers, all about the infamous generation that has dominated politics for my entire life. That's only just come out, so I think I'm probably going to watch that this week, maybe even this evening. See what went down. You also get early access to videos from creators like Real Engineering and Jetlag. Jetlag the game. Can't live without that. I'm fully Team Adam, by the way, just to make it clear. Just so you know. But yeah, now when you sign up to Nebula, you also get guest passes. So 1 week a month, you can share it with your friends, your auntie, your estranged labradoodle, whoever you like. You can share Nebula with them. If all of this sounds good to you, go to nebula.tv/Stefan Milo. The link is down below somewhere. You can get it for a mere $3 a month. $3 a month, $36 a year. Is that right? Yes, it is. And you can get it even a lifetime pass for $300. Christmas present to yourself. Huge thanks to Nebula for sponsoring this video and helping me make what I make. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. Check it out, go sign up for Nebula.